Hello and welcome, whoever is already here. As some of you know, I like to always do a little bit of mindfulness before I start a presentation. You're here, I know it's lunchtime, you might be feeling hungry, you've already had put in a day of half a day of work and it's Friday. So if you want to take a couple of seconds to take a couple of deep breaths and relax before the weekend, I invite you to close your eyes and let go of all of your breath. And feel your stomach going in as you let go of your breath, and then breathe in, feeling the bottom of your lungs, the middle of your lungs, and the top of your lungs. And breathe out again. And breathe in, bottom of your lungs, middle of your lungs, top of your lungs. Relax your face, relax your forehead, relax your cheeks, relax the back of your neck. And when you breathe, we don't think about it, but sometimes we lift up your shoulders. So just drop your shoulders and feel good about that. Okay. And I'd like you to bring to mind somebody who when you're around, you feel loved by and cared by, and hold them in your heart, and hold yourself in your heart, and be kind to yourself. The one concept I want to begin to invite people to is really to, practice ahimsa. Ahimsa is do no harm, and the first place you do no harm is to yourself. When you practice doing no harm to yourself, it also brings about empathy, which is where you begin to look at other people, and that is our topic for today. It is empathy, and how do you leverage empathy in leadership? And I want to talk about a few different concepts of empathy that haven't been talked about before, and you'll see what that is. And empathy comes under interpersonal management, right? It's one of the key factors of interpersonal management, because empathy is something where you are really able to connect with another person. Um, and whoever's here, when you look at this slide, I wanted you to think about what comes to mind, right? What is the thought process that comes to mind? What is it that you feel and you relate to when you look at this image? And maybe what might you do if you were in the presence of this person? Have you felt this way at some point? Where was this thing that happened to you that you maybe felt this way? Whatever you want to name this feeling. So I want you to think about what that is, what that feeling is. Like, right? It's like, I am going crazy, maybe, or this is scary, whatever that is. So you're beginning to associate emotions with something, and that is really the beginning of empathy in some ways. So what is empathy? Empathy is, it's multifaceted. It's how you think about um how the ability that enables individuals to understand, share, and respond to the emotions and perspectives of others. And empathy encompasses both affective and cognitive components. And there's also another part to this that a lot of people don't talk about, which is um, empathic concern. It's sort of the, not only is it cognitive, not only is it affective, which is, thought, emotions, but there's a big compassionate piece to it that we will talk about. What are the key aspects of empathy? You're going to go through this, and then we'll get into some stories. Or maybe let's just get into some stories. For example, let's think about Sarah. Right, Sarah is a very supportive manager. She's been a friend who's been genuinely interested in other people. And when her best friend Liam, for example, is struggling with a career crisis, Liam doesn't work with her; he's just a good friend. Sarah doesn't offer any quick fixes, right? Instead, Sarah goes into her own experiences and tries to understand where Liam is coming from. And so she's, spends some time letting him really talk about, what is going on with him. And that's cognitive empathy, where you're beginning to begin to understand what the other person's thought process is, and then begins to resonate, like so you're beginning to resonate what that person's talking about. That is the emotional empathy part, right? So she resonates with his depth of you know career disillusionment. And that's something maybe some of you are beginning to relate to. I'm hearing a lot of frustration in the work world, a lot of burnout. There are things that are happening politically that has made some workplaces really difficult to be. So there's this disillusionment of career that Liam has, that Sarah begins to resonate with. And so this resonation allows her to truly connect with his pain, right? Connection with pain, which is part of empathy. And then Sarah uses this to communicate. The compassionate empathy part I talked about is feeling compassion, feeling concern that this person is going through this. And that concern is communicated once you resonate with what they are feeling. So what are these aspects, right? So the perspective taking, the resonance comes from, okay, he's saying something, I'm really beginning to hear it. I'm then beginning to go into the back of my brain and pull out things that I resonate with. I might not fully get his emotions, but at least I'm beginning to understand it. And the listening part was there. She's really listening to what he's doing. And then recognizing emotional cues, watching the person's face, and if you don't recognize the cues fully, curiosity, the questioning part can help, where it's like, okay, I see you, I see your body this way. I see, I might be misinterpreting what I see your face looking angry when you're telling me you're sad. That's a difficult thing to say, but in some ways then that person also begins to become more aware of what they're going through, and then they may be able to express that. They go, yeah, I'm really angry and I'm also sad. So recognizing facial cues and expressing them verbally and trying to get deeper with that person is a form of is really being truly a different level of empathic. And you can also sometimes feel what they're feeling. One of the things that as a therapist I've been trained is, in the past we would be like, you really have to be this blank slate, right? You're just there for somebody to talk to you about. But I think the most powerful sessions I've had is when I could really feel the person's feelings, and sometimes I would tear up. And I tell my clients, don't worry about me. I'm tearing up because I can feel this pain in you that you are not ready to really feel for yourself. And the most interesting thing is that allows the other person to cry. We live in a society where painful, vulnerable emotions are actually hidden because there is this belief that somehow we have to be strong all the time. And leadership is definitely affected by this, right? That you don't allow yourself to be vulnerable to what is happening, or that you might be going through a difficult time today. And that doesn't mean you're not a strong person. So even in coaching or therapy, when as a coach or a therapist I am able to truly feel it, and if I do, it's not like every time I feel it, but I can sense that, and I feel it deeply and it shows on my face. It gives the client permission to open up. It gives your friend permission to open up and feel that feeling. And it is that release of feeling that really builds resilience. So I want to invite you to be okay feeling it, unless, and you really need to be okay letting go of that feeling. And that's why I reassure my clients that I might be feeling this in a second because I'm truly reflecting what you're feeling. But don't worry, at the end of the session, I'll be okay. I have a lot of self management techniques that I can go to, and it does make me feel better. So you need to know what your level of resonating empathy is and showing empathy is, and how to use it most effectively to build that connection. Because once you build that connection, you're going to be respected a lot more as a leader. And that is going to create an emotional environment where people want to perform for you. So I really want you to think about that. And then that empathic concern part, which is, when you're looking at an emotional cue of somebody and you reflect it to them and you reflect your concern to them, which is I really want you to feel better. I understand how you're feeling, and what can I do to help you? Or you don't give the answers. You ask the person the questions so they're able to tell you what they need from you. And then, like I said, you manage your own emotions while you're responding to that person. So you can be crying more than the other person, because you're feeling so sad for them. And I'll talk about a couple of types of empathy, which we'll talk more about. If you're not able to self-regulate, how that's not very healthy empathy. So if you're able to quickly recognize emotions, if you're able to communicate your emotion, if you're able to modulate your emotion, and use your emotion effectively, um, in general, that will help you be more empathic. So the ability to recognize emotion, to communicate emotion, to modulate your own emotion, and use that emotion in the right way. We talk about this. I know all of you have heard of the story Goldilocks. Hopefully, it's like they go, the soup is too hot, the soup is too cold, and then there's just the right amount of soup. So this right amount of using your own emotions while you modulate it to support the other person, right, is empathy. That is empathy for the other person. And sometimes some people can feel the emotions, some people are not able to truly feel another's emotions, and they're going to have to learn how to maximize their cognitive ability to communicate empathy. Because I want to invite you to the fact that some people truly can't fully feel another person's emotions. Some people are wired that way. And there's no right or wrong. I mean, the universe has created us in these many, many different ways. And we have to understand and be aware of our own wiring and how we're going to use it in our personal relationships and in our leadership. So if you are somebody who can see somebody else's emotions, like see but not truly feel it, maybe able to hear it, then one of the things you're going to have to learn to do is how do you cognitively use your words to express what you think they might be feeling and learn more and grow there. We all have areas to grow, and so I just want you to think about that. When I was taking pictures for my website, I had a client with me, and this picture was captured. And when I look at it, she was supposed to be just pretending, but we got into a conversation, and I can see how I was totally present there. So I want you to look at that expression on my face, which is completely present. And I had my hands towards me because I was communicating, like, I'm feeling this and I want to express more to you. So it was a very natural space. And so if you are not sure about how you look and how you empathize, I encourage you to sort of film yourself when you're working with somebody, with a friend or something, to watch your nonverbals. As a leader, if you want to develop empathy, it's really important to understand how you are expressing it, how you're showing up in that space. So, my invitation, one technique and one tip is film yourself when you're talking to somebody so that you can see how you're expressing yourself, and, ask somebody for feedback. And that can help you coach yourself into being better in expressing your empathy in the nonverbal way. Because expressing, feeling empathy is one, expressing it is where you connect, right? So how do you express it verbally? How do you express it affectively? How do you express it non-verbally? All of these pieces are important if you're a leader trying to use empathy, which empathy is one of the most important things in interpersonal communication. Because whether you realize it or not, that part is where, again, connection comes, and connection is the driver in how people feel and how people perform. So this is a part of empathy. I was thinking about what I wanted to talk to you about, and I wanted to present something that, a lot of people have talked about the pieces of empathy that I've talked about, but I want you to think about these different types of empathy. One is empathy for others, which we've been talking about. The part that we don't often talk about is empathy for self. So I will go into empathy for self. Self-centered empathy or projective empathy is a part of leadership that is not healthy. And over empathy is something that can hurt yourself. So let's talk a little bit about it. What does empathy for self look like? We've already talked about empathy for other. Empathy for self is termed sometimes as self compassion, right? It's extending that kindness and understanding and acceptance to oneself, especially during moments of perceived inadequacy, suffering, or failure. So I recently was talking to a client who grew up in a very critical household. He's a senior leader, and this client was in a situation where his child was in danger, and because his child was in danger, he protected his child by that somebody was attacking the child verbally, and the client then went ahead and tried to calmly talk to this person, but the person was continuing to attack their child. And so then the client, raised his voice and spoke to this person and then got the person to back off. But the client was always self critical about never wanting to raise his voice because he saw so much of emotional abuse in his family, and so felt very guilty and ashamed about the fact that he raised his voice at this person. So one of the things we had to work through is the fact that by choice in the beginning, and he felt this sense of, if I do this, then I'm a bad person. Because I did this, maybe I lost control. Maybe what if I lose more control? A lot of negative thoughts about self and trusting self came out, which happens when people grew up in traumatic environments where they don't really learn to trust themselves or their abilities. And they set up very harsh rules for themselves, like, I will never do XYZ, as a way of not repeating the cycle. It's healthy because they don't want to repeat the cycle of abuse. But on the flip side, they are also not giving themselves flexibility for when different sort of situations happen. So he was not being self-compassionate to himself. And so I asked him to think about, what if somebody was observing this behavior? What if somebody else was standing there watching them? What would that person say? And the response he came was like, if I was standing there watching somebody else, I would come up to that person and say, I'm so sorry you had to go through this. I'm so sorry your daughter had to go through this. You wouldn't stand there and judge him for raising his voice, because he did try doing the right thing first. And as he could visualize how somebody else could be compassionate to him, we worked on how he could internalize that image to himself. Because the the ability, you have a lot of people have the ability to empathize with others, but they're not being compassionate to themselves. So I want to invite yourself to the concept of empathy for yourself. And if you're not able to do it easily, you need, and there's sort of these deep underlying things you need to unearth, which is what we unearthed in the session. One of the quickest ways you can sort of feel better is visualize this one person. Remember when we started this session, I talked about bringing this one person that was safe and secure into your world, into your mind, somebody who is your cheerleader, somebody who probably cares for you. Bring that person in and see what that person would tell you, right? How would they express compassion for you? And try to internalize that if you are unable to be empathic to yourself. So I invite you to this concept of empathy for yourself, because empathy for yourself is one of the most important things, before also which will help you be more empathic to others. When you're unempathic to yourself, sometimes you can get into a bad mood, right? You're feeling stressed. That makes it very difficult to be empathic to others. That makes it difficult for you to be present to family or in leadership. So before empathy for others, I want you to think about empathy for yourself. I'm going to the next concept, which is self-centered empathy. What do I mean by self-centered empathy? This is related to one of the concepts I've talked before. You might recognize this outside in people, and understand that if this comes up sometimes for you, this is not a healthy thing in leadership. So self-centered empathy describes sort of a superficial, possibly sometimes manipulative form of empathy, where an individual identifies as and understands the other person's emotions, but primarily uses it to serve their own agenda. And it involves, again, cognitive empathy, where they understand what the other person feels, emotional empathy, genuine resonance, but, and, desire to help, but really the desire to help is to help themselves. It is associated with the dark triad traits, which are Machiavellism, narcissism, and psychopathy. Now, it doesn't mean they are psychopaths, but there are these traits or states where the person can get very constricted and possibly even stressed out. And so the empathy for others may become a very self-centered empathy because they're feeling trapped, and so whatever is happening is resonating more in terms of what they're feeling versus what the other person's feeling, and it may come across as it might hurt other people. So the person can come across as very charming. So let me tell you a story of Max. Max is incredibly charming and gets people. When his girlfriend Chloe expressed her deep insecurity about her appearance initially, he listened very well. He resonated with it, and you can say how much I understand how much this hurts you. I know this is a difficult thing, but then later on, he subtly wove in comments that reinforced that because she felt this way, she was dependent on him, and began to slowly make her feel bad about herself and isolate her from others who would challenge his influence. So this is where sometimes empathy can be self-centered and be used against a person. Projective empathy is slightly different. It's where the person isn't really aware fully, and they can see the situation as it is, but they're really projecting a lot of their own insecurities and difficult feelings in what is happening in front of them. And this kind of projective empathy is not matching what is out there. It can come across as anxiety, it can come across as overbearing, and that is not helpful in a leadership situation. So, in terms of what I said, my first example of Sarah, who had empathy for others, she would be a good leader because she would truly resonate what's happening with her team, listen to them, express her resonance of emotions, and show genuine, care and concern, and then ask them, how situation can be fixed, how she could be helpful, or maybe get the team's input on how the situation can be helped so that people could feel better. And Sarah could go back and take care of herself after this, this meeting that took up a little energy of hers, or maybe a lot of energy of hers, and that's empathy for herself. But a leader who is more self-centered and is projective, like I was talking about Max, Max could possibly read the room and win over clients. But in team meetings, for example, if there is somebody who is young or just vulnerable and is sort of insecure a little bit, Max could say, acknowledge the fear and say, I understand this is overwhelming. But then in a later follow-up, he was he would say he would guide her, right? So we're talking about Max and Emily, for example. Emily is subordinate, and initially Max is charming and says, Emily, I'm going to help you. I understand this is difficult. I understand this is really overwhelming for you. But later on, Max kind of takes over, and Max says, I'm going to do this. I'm going to do this. You're not able to do this. And it brings down Emily's confidence. And Emily, in her desire to please him and her fear of failure, it would drive her to overwork because she wants to continue to please Max. And Max has now used his insight of her insecurity to make Emily do a lot more work and also not reward her. And therefore she feels she has to work harder and harder. And so now so this cycle has gone from initially Max encouraging Emily, trying to be helpful, to then Max taking it over and saying she can't do well, and then Max saying, like, you can do it well, and then giving her too much. And this way, Max is able to let go of a lot of responsibility and manipulate Emily into doing more work. So self-centered projective empathy can be not very healthy in leadership. And if you recognize this and you're in the other position, I want you to consider what you want to do to get out of your vulnerable space. So this is a different aspect of empathy that people don't talk about. And I'm hoping this is helpful for others. And the other part of empathy I want to talk about is the over empathy person, somebody who is overly sensitive. We are now learning about neurodiversity. We're learning about how many people are have a lot of sensory. Some people have sensory issues, not many, but there's a good percentage where sight, sound, smells can be overwhelming. So they're taking in emotions and thought processes in a much more overwhelming way. The other part of oversensitive empathy is somebody who has always been vulnerable, and maybe has been in an abusive environment and has been protective of others and trying to make others feel happy. And then, so they are oversensitive in terms of their empathy and want to fix, and they take on the burden of empathy. So there's two ways you can be an over empathic person. One, if you have sensory stuff and it begins to overwhelm you, and two, if you are possibly have grown up in abusive situations and you've been trying to fix them, or you're perfectionistic. That can also be one of the reasons there's over empathy, because you really get too much into the situation and want you feel a lot and then you want to fix it, which can be exhausting to you. So over empathy is not very healthy for yourself, and it can also create in a leadership arena. If you're over empathic and you take on too much of everybody else's emotions in the team, you're going to be exhausted. And if you're over empathic and you want to fix everything, then you're not actually able to guide team members to become, you may become too enabling, and that's not going to help your team grow, because you want to help your team grow, which means you want to be the right amount of empathic so that you can help them find solutions for themselves. So I want to invite you to sort of thinking about, are you over empathic and is that affecting you? So I'll give you an example of somebody who's over empathic. Lena is a highly intelligent graphic designer, and she often found social situations overwhelming. She wasn't just observing people, right? She was feeling their anxieties, their quiet joys, the underlying tension in the conversation through intense emotional empathy. So if someone came across the room and felt awkward, Lena would feel it physically, and this would become like a wave of discomfort. So after an hour at the party, she would be utterly drained. She might experience headaches and need quite a few days of solitude to recover. These heightened sensory perceptions meant that even, ambient noise and lighting could be intensified, and there's a lot of emotional absorption of all of this. So if you are anybody like Lena, I hope you become aware that this sort of over empathy and over emotional drawing in of sensory issues is difficult for you. So you have to begin to find ways to manage your sensory overload and not get into the over empathic space, because that is exhausting for you and that would hurt your leadership, right? So the way it could play out is, like I said, there's a brainstorming group in a team meeting, and they, after the brainstorming sessions, if one person is very frustrated with one of the things that was said, and Lena didn't understand it intellectually, like what the frustration was, but really really felt the frustration very deeply to the point of physical discomfort, she won't be able to discuss the project further and be able to lead the team further. So that kind of emotional over empathy then leads into having high stress, and therefore having needing to then learn to manage stress. But preemptively, if somebody like Lena could understand that they're an over empathic person, they can work on ways of protecting themselves and slowing down a meeting, or slowing down things, doing some deep breathing. There's many techniques you can use that coaching can help you with, to help you not be over empathic. So in summary, we talked about different kinds of empathy, for others, for self, what kind of empathy could be harmful in leadership and what kind of empathy could be harmful to you. So I want you to think about these things. And we've talked about all of this in the sort of like what is a low empathy state, where you might struggle to recognize others' emotions and have difficulty understanding their perspectives. So this would hinder your interpersonal relationships, and your emotional regulation, right? Managing your own emotions. And if you're not able to manage your own emotions, you're not going to be able to manage conflict. You're not going to be able to manage group situation very well. Medium empathy, you're able to moderately understand it and share feelings, but the implications of having medium empathy is that you're able to do social interaction well, but you would need to work a little bit to understand how to increase your empathy so that you can work better. So in medium empathy, you might miss some subtle cues, and that might create confusion among your team members. So that would be something you would need to work on to improve. And of course, in high empathy, you have a strong ability to affectively, emotionally, cognitively, compassionately resonate with another person's emotions and communicate it. And so we don't need to be high on empathy all the time. When we are having a difficult time at home, when there's stressors, we have to be very compassionate to ourselves and understand that our empathy level might be low when we're struggling to manage ourselves. So we don't need to be highly empathic 100% of the time. And if you're as empathic as possible, about 75 to 80% of the time in your work situations as leaders, by having self empathy and knowing when you can show up that way and when you may not be able to show up that way, it will be very effective in leadership. If you're not able to show up that way, I invite you to be a little bit vulnerable with your team and express to them that this is a difficult space. You're having a bad day, you might be a little bit lower in how you connect, and most people have empathy and they will be empathic to you in those days. So allow yourself a little bit of grace when you're practicing empathy, and allow other people also to show empathy towards you. So I'm going to end with that. I hope this was a great learning experience for you, and I will see you again in 2 or 3 weeks. Thank you, everybody.